letting all of the participants in so that everybody can kind of be introduced. And then what we will do is we will eventually phase everybody out as we begin the main part of our program for tonight. So this is kind of just a great way so that we can all see how many people from across the world are participating in tonight's event. And excellent. Look at 29 early Jews. It's amazing. They're definitely not Israeli.
Not Jewish.
Yeah, they're not Israeli, that's for sure. I'm letting in Hank Schneider right now. Hank is like one of my dad's oldest friends from Cincinnati. Michael, Rabbi Smolkin actually took over the congregation that I grew up in from ages 4 to 18 until leaving for college and then Israel. And I was very lucky. He's only been in the community for a year and a half. So I got to see him right before COVID started. We got to have a really great talk. I mean,
I'm good. Rabbi Smolkin, where are you speaking from? Where are you right now?
My home.
Okay.
I'm less than half a mile from the synagogue. So
Cincinnati.
In Cincinnati.
Right here in Cincinnati, yeah.
It's a lovely city.
So the Hyman go to I know Yoav used to work for Standard Textile.
He did. I've been to Cincinnati a lot because of Standard Textile.
So
yeah,
they're there. It's a huge synagogue, actually. Like, I mean,
I think I've been in that synagogue. I think I've been in that synagogue.
You've definitely been there before, for sure.
Yeah, it was
and
one of
you should definitely come back.
When I went to Cincinnati, just parenthetically, I had the most security I've ever had as ambassador anywhere. We had like snipers all over the place because there was the Secret Service, American Secret Service, had uncovered an Iranian plot to assassinate me. So the only time I had both Israeli security and American security, and I had scheduled this talk in Cincinnati, and oh my God, I can't believe just the firepower they had out in front of that synagogue.
Wow.
My God.
So yeah.
Hey, Michael, Daniel.
Wonderful Iranians.
Just wanted to say hi, Michael. It's from Daniel Heifetz.
Hey, Dan. Hi, Dan. How you doing? How's Jane?
Hey, good to see you. Everyone's fine. Everyone's fine. Got the grandchildren. I'm on my farm in Virginia.
Unbelievable. You guys are great. We miss you here. Come back.
We miss you.
Come over here and get vaccinated. You know that Israel's leading the world in vaccination.
I know. They don't even know when we can in Virginia. It's crazy.
We both had our first vaccinations. I'm scheduled for another one in like a week and a half. I'll get my second vaccination.
I got to get vaccinated, and I want to pull the only child card. Just like I can get vaccinated early. No, because it's legitimate.
I didn't even know that was a card. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no. Iris had to. I don't know who asked, but my mother had signed special forms just for me to serve over the green line.
Hello. I just wanted to say hello. Janet and Tobin are on. Hi, Michael. It's Janet Tobin. I hope you remember.
Good, Janet. I don't see you.
Let's see. I can't find you. My picture.
All right, tell them from the conference.
You know me from the Conference of Presidents.
I'm just going to see Janet. Hi.
Yeah.
Janet, so lovely to have you tonight. Thank you for joining us.
We're looking forward to it, Erwin and I.
I'm letting all the latecomers in the event, and I have to say there are so many people that not all of you fit on my screen. So now we've got more than 2 screenfuls of people, which is absolutely fantastic. At 10:05, we'll begin our program. I'm just letting all the latecomers in. Very excited to begin the show.
Don't get excited.
Just a word of caution, a cautionary note, and that is that because of COVID and because of the lockdown in Israel, there are millions of people using the internet, and sometimes it can get a little dicey here. So if anybody's having trouble hearing me, please let me know, and we'll stop and make sure that the internet's working.
I'll definitely send you a. Do you have your phone on you?
I do.
That one you spoke. You said
First, we need to on the phone.
They know who I am.
Okay, we just have a few more people coming in. We're almost done.
1 second. Adam. Several people are writing me saying they're having trouble getting in. They're asking for registration to register.
I'm getting that too. Hold on. I'm letting them in right now.
Okay.
Tom, you're in. Yeah. Okay. You're in. Okay. No problem. You're there. Bye. They were just on the Steve Wolf is probably one of them, and Steve Mandel.
Adam, they don't have registrations. They didn't see the registrations at the bottom of the receipt. So I've been sending them to people.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
We can also just send them the WhatsApp message with the passcode on it.
He's in. My buddy Dan Kliansky's in, wherever you are, Dan. Okay.
The other thing is I got in and it took about 2 or 3 minutes before my name came up. So
Fantastic. Well, it looks like everybody's in, and we've got almost 80 participants tonight, which is just
Great.
absolutely fantastic. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Tonight is an absolute pleasure for me because I'm getting to do something that is very special. We're getting to host a webinar with my very close friend, Michael Oren, and the person that is going to be running the show tonight is the rabbi who took over the synagogue in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I grew up, which was the synagogue, I would say, that was extremely formative in helping create the identity in which I have that connected me so strongly to Israel, in addition to the Jewish day school that worked hand in hand specifically with our synagogue. And I think that's a really important thing because the thing that Michael and I both share is that we're both immigrants and we were both brought up in the conservative movement. And if I could ask everybody to mute themselves, that would be great. And I think that this is a very special opportunity. Today, we are not having Michael speak to us as an ambassador or as a member of Knesset, but he is coming to us today as a writer and as Michael himself, which I think is a very important opportunity because one of the great things that we're going to be able to do is kind of break down the distance that Michael has had with many people in the diaspora because he's seen as the member of Knesset and ambassador. And tonight he's going to kind of give us a glimpse of his creative thought process, his writing process. If Rabbi Smolkin's questions are good enough, he should be extrapolating quite some Jewish context. And I'm sure he should be fitting in some questions about the immigration process in Israel today, because all of these short stories from Michael's really great book, The Night Archer, come from Michael's experience. I just want to, before I begin to introduce our interviewer and our interviewee, I just want to say to Michael, one, thanks for joining us. And not a lot of people know this, but Michael was the first bigwig that I ever met when I began my career. And my first week after graduating college, I flew to the Christians United for Israel conference in Washington, D.C., because at the time, my friend John Winchester, who is from Tucson, Arizona, became the head of their entire campus division. And at that point, I was kind of helping him build the framework in Arizona of how we would take it nationally. So I got to work really close with them. And at that time, there was this like really cool guy who had published like these New York Times bestsellers, who all of a sudden had become the most famous Israeli ambassador to the United States that we had probably had since, I don't know, Abba Ibn, like maybe Bibi Netanyahu, maybe Bibi, but I think Bibi was the UN. I don't think he ever did America.
He did. He was the number 2 guy.
So then I guess after Golda and Bibi, like you'll have to take it. But I got to sit on the floor with Michael Oren at 22 years old, right before I made Aliyah. And we listened to Echa together. And that was my first introduction to Michael. And I got to work on his campaigns. We lived down the street from each other. He's been an amazing mentor and an even better friend. So obviously the man needs no introduction. This is Michael Oren, former ambassador to the United States from the state of Israel, PhD from Princeton, if I'm correct. Correct. Right. Middle Eastern history. Eastern history. The first book that you published was on the 1957 war, and your first bestseller was 6 Days of War, which was the next war after that. He also had the New York Times bestseller, Power, Faith, and Fantasy. After that, he became ambassador. He was also a fellow at the Shalem Center. After being an ambassador, he became a member of Knesset and the, if I'm correct, Deputy Minister of Public Diplomacy in the Prime Minister's office.
One of those titles.
One of those titles. One of those titles. It was, there you go. I mean, Michael is without a doubt one of the most accomplished immigrants from the American community to Israel, and it's a pleasure to have him here. Now to introduce the rabbi, Rabbi Smolkin. Rabbi Smolkin grew up in Houston, Texas, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. He holds a BA in mathematics from Brandeis and a master's in mathematics, or an MAT in mathematics education from Tufts. He went to rabbinic school at Ziegler School and American Jewish University, and he taught high school mathematics in Boston for 5 years. He interned as a interfaith chaplain at the UCLA hospital, spent a year in Jerusalem interning at Mishkon Tefilio in Venice, California, and received awards for excellence in Talmud. The rabbi has served as the rabbi of the Ohavei Zion Synagogue in Lexington, Kentucky for 10 years. Congregation visitors from all over the country commented on the unique Torah discussions that Rabbi Smolkin created, and his classes on Tanakh and Bible attracted students from the Jewish community and beyond. I will say this, that Rabbi Smolkin brings a special touch to his Torah without question. Rabbi Smolkin and his wife Talia have been blessed with 2 young children who love music and dance, reading and chess, and are full of questions. And they also know their parents say that above all, they should be mensches. It's cute. In addition to his love of learning Torah, Talmud, and Jewish mysticism, the rabbi also enjoys studying religious studies in general and learning languages. Greek is his current interest. Okay, we have a lot to talk about. And the study in the marital arts as well. Rabbi has also been the rabbi of Adif Israel Synagogue for the last 18 months. Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. We are thrilled that this is our second Ma'il Chaim with a wonderful Israeli who can break down complexities and connect us all to Israel from abroad. Would anybody like to participate in the wine tasting, or should I just ask the rabbi and Michael about their wine and get to it? Gary would like to participate. Could I just get a message on my messaging board who would like to participate? That would be fantastic. If you could just PM me, I'll see it. So tonight for Ma'il Chaim, we are drinking the Bravdo Coupage, which is the blend. It's from the right outside of the Judean Hills. It's part Cabernet Franc, part Cabernet, part Cabernet Franc, 44%, 33% Shiraz, and 33% Cab Sauv. Bravdo is one of the few estate wineries in the country. It was built in 1949. They produce just under 100,000 bottles. They are right outside of the largest archaeological dig in the country of the municipal county of Gezer, and they produce some of the best wine in the country. So whoever has their wine is more than welcome to take a sniff and a smell quite quickly. Michael, I gotta ask, what do you think? Because I know you're a white wine drinker.
Oh. It tastes like Jewish sovereignty. You know?
Gary, what about you? Where's Mr. Smith? Let me unmute him. Hold on one second.
I like this better than some of the others. It does have a little bite. When you open it up, you have to let it breathe for a little. It's kind of medium.
We can't hear you.
Gotta mute.
It's between heavy and medium bodied. It does
Gary, hold
not
on.
have the taste, so I'm kind of enjoying it.
Rabbi, what about you?
Oh, it was great. I had a little wine earlier, and it was great.
Fantastic. Tom?
So
Everybody can
Adam,
mute themselves, please.
yeah, I kind of cheated because I looked up the wine beforehand and said to let it breathe for a while. Let it breathe for about a half an hour. It's a very smooth wine. I taste a little bit of oak and a little bit of like blackberries or some kind of fruit.
Hold on, Tom. 1 second. We're just having an audio problem. Can everybody please mute themselves?
It's Michael Hall who needs to mute.
Sorry about that, Tom.
No
I'm looking at 79 boxes. I apologize for not getting to that quicker.
So I cheated a little bit. I looked up the wine in advance. It said let it breathe for a little bit. I've let it breathe for about a half an hour. And I taste a little bit of oak and a little bit of blackberry or blueberry kind of taste to it. Very very complex wine. I like it a lot.
I definitely agree with you on the blueberry. What did Leslie think of this wine, Michael?
She doesn't drink wine.
She likes white wine.
She doesn't like white wine. No, she doesn't drink.
Oh, I thought.
No
Okay.
coffee, no tea, no that. She, she's a Mormon.
So, if would anybody else like to chime in on the wine?
I would like to chime in this for Michael, and I'm Glenn Seidman, New England Regional Chair. Had wanted to say, since you said that you tend to like white wine better, what I had locally at the butchery in Coolidge Corner down the block is the Bravo Chardonnay.
Oh, that's a good wine.
That the color is not the color of a usual Chardonnay. And when I taste it, it's a very complex taste that tastes like it's a blend of whiskey and Chardonnay, and very interesting.
Ooh. Can we get a bottle of that shipped over, Adam, like now?
I could send Lori over to you, but she would kill me.
Really, right now.
She
don't
wants
hesitate.
To hear the talk. She wants to hear
Don't
the talk.
collect.
So I can't do it.
No.
Well, listen,
Thank you,
everybody, I want to say thank you for participating in the small wine tasting that we're doing. Next time, we're going to make sure that everybody has the wine for our next talk, which I believe is with your good friend, Einat Wilf, Michael. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove all of the boxes, and it will just be the rabbi and Michael, and then I will pop in at the end in about 40 minutes when the Q&A will begin. For Q&A, please direct your questions to me. You can either send them to me privately or put them in the box. I will also be taking notes. And please remember to keep your questions to the topic of which we are discussing, which are Michael's short stories and Michael's experiences. This is not a political commentary or an episode of CNN or Fox and Friends. So we look forward to being taken away on a wonderful night journey. So l'chaim, and we shall begin. Rabbi Smolkin, take it away.
All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and it's such a pleasure to meet you. Naim Ma'od, Michael. Actually, we met before at APAC, but that was some time ago, and I expect you meet a tremendous number of people at APAC. So it's wonderful to see you again and to have this opportunity to connect with you. I just want to, before kind of formally going and asking questions about the Night Archer, and I put again for everyone, I put the link to the Amazon link to where you can purchase the Night Archer. I highly recommend it. I put that in the chat, so you can just click that link and go to Amazon to make that purchase. But before we get into kind of questions about the book, I just wanted to take a moment to wish comfort for you and your family on the passing of your father. I think we're right at the time of Shloshim, and
right now.
Yeah,
right now.
Yeah.
Just changed.
It's the 19th of Tevet. Today, it was the 19th of Kislev then?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Zichrono livracha, may his memory be for a blessing for you and your family.
Thank you.
So it's a tradition, of course, in Judaism to honor our loved ones with learning Torah. And I really see, as I read your stories from the Night Archer, I really feel that there is so much Torah in there. There's an idea, this comes actually from the first Psalm, Uvatorah yageh yomam v'layla. The first Psalm has this phrase that in his Torah, this person who lives a blessed life in his Torah, this person will study day and night. And the question is, well, whose Torah is it? Well, in the Psalm, it's in God's Torah that it's talking about. But our sages say that in his Torah, in the individual's Torah. And from this, our sages learn that each individual person has Torah to teach, their own individual Torah. And so I really see that in the Night Archer, you're teaching like a tremendous Torah there. There's so much to learn. One of the things that I personally look for when I'm looking at short stories is what impressions does it leave me with? And so there are a lot of images from the book that I'm really left with after these stories, images that come up, some of them lovely images, some of them more challenging, but all of them powerful images. And for my first real question about the book, I wanted to ask you, the book for everyone, I really encourage everyone to go and purchase this book, The Night Archer. There are so many stories, they are so diverse. And it's interesting, again, in Judaism, there's kind of such a focus on the idea of the one, right? One God creating the plurality of all of us, right? All of us are made in the image of God, and yet all of us are so different, right? One creator, but many people that are created. And in the book, you are one author. How do you go and create so many different personalities, so many different situations? How are you as one individual able to, so to speak, see in and describe so many different lives?
Thank you, Rabbi Smolkin. First of all, thank you all for hosting me tonight. You know, to the Federation of the Men's Clubs, to Gary Smith and Tom Sudo, thank you. Thank you to my dear friend Adam Bello, and to the Wine on the Vine and the Israel Innovation Fund. Toda Rabah, thank you. Thank you for the very kind words about my father, Rabbi Smolkin, an extraordinary man who led a long and very good life. And the answer to the question, how do I do it? It's terrifying. It's utterly terrifying. And people ask me where these stories come from. And I can tell you the experiences they come from. I mean, I spent 35 years in the Israeli military. I was a lone soldier here as an officer. I participated in several wars. And there are some short story writers, some fiction writers, if they were in a war, that's what they write about. You read, you know, a novelist like James Jones or a short story writer like Tim O'Brien, they write about their war stories. All of my war experiences get packed into one story, which is exactly 1 page long. 1 page long. That's one experience. But I worked in Hollywood. I was Orson Welles' assistant, believe it or not. So there's a story about being an assistant to an aging, sort of decadent Hollywood type. Washington, lots of years in Washington. Stories about, I have 3 children, 5 grandchildren. So there's stories about fathers and sons and mothers and daughters, that dynamic. And there's stories about Judaism and Israel. And some of the stories are clearly about Israel, though Israel maybe not be expressly mentioned. Stories about the Holocaust, which cut very, very deeply. Including one story that takes place in the village in Lithuania, from where my grandmother was born, and which I visited when I did a state visit to Ethiopia, to Lithuania, and they brought me to this village, and very powerful emotions. So it comes from there, but most of the fact, when I get an inspiration for the story, it comes to me and I don't go to it. And my first reaction is always, oh no, I can't write that. That's too much out of the box. That's too far beyond anything I remotely experienced. 2 of my favorite stories in this collection, by the way, there are 51 stories in this collection. We had to cut it off at a certain point because they kept coming. 2 of my favorite stories are unfortunately 2 of the longest stories and 2 of the more challenging stories. And Rabbi Smolkin, I hope I didn't ruin your night with the story Metaxas, which is a deeply philosophical story. But it's a story that takes place on the American frontier at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in the year 1841. And it's told from the perspective of the commander of this American outpost there, who has encountered in the hills of the Rockies, he's encountered a monster. Okay. So it's a horror story. It's sort of a Gothic story, but I had to get the language right. So I had to go and research military correspondence from the 1840s, because I wanted to get the language just right. I want to get the structure of his letters just right. and I taught military history, so I know the uniforms and I know the guns, but that was tremendously challenging. When I first thought of this story, I was traveling across the American South and following the Freedom Trail, from Atlanta to Montgomery to Selma to Macon. And all of a sudden, the story about this outpost at the foothills of the Rockies in 1841, where the hell did that come from? Who knows? And my first reaction was, no, that can't be. My other favorite story is a story called The Betsy Bob, which is about four Jewish, it's a very Jewish story. It's actually a midrash on a midrashic story about the four rabbis who go into the woods, and I'm sure you understood that reference.
Yes.
But four Jewish girls who go to a Ritchie summer camp in Maine. And at the summer camp, they encounter something in the woods which changes their lives, each one of their lives irrevocably. And then later, as grown women, each with their own lives, each with their own problems, they go back into the woods and try to re-experience this spiritual revelation. What do I know about girls' camps in Maine? When this idea came to me, I saw this spiritual being called the Betsy Bob. I had no idea how it impacted these women's lives. And these women's wives, one of them is a Reform rabbi, one of the women, who's married to her cantor, another woman, and going through all sorts of difficulties in life. There's a stand-up comic, and there's a mother of a very ill child, and there's a high-level executive. What do I know about any of this? When the story hit me, my reaction was, oh no, I can't possibly write that. That is so beyond anything that I can sort of capture in fiction. And yet, what can I say? Whether it's the Metaxas or the Betsy Bob, these stories actually left me with no choice.
Well, and those are two great stories with radically different perspectives, different things going on with the individuals in the story, right? So Metaxas has the protagonist who has, among other things, a desire for learning, right? There's a desire maybe not to be right there, right? And the Betsy Bob, of course, there's another strong desire for something needed in perhaps the protagonist's life that are very different desires. One of the things in the Betsy Bob that I find with a number of the stories is that there's a twist at the end.
Yeah, I like the twist.
And the twist, yes, I was very surprised by the twist. There are a number of the stories that have a twist, that have something unexpected at the end. It's obviously it's something in terms of the writing style. It's something that I really appreciate. I really love. The writer Cortázar is famous for this. One of his stories, La Noche Boca Arriba, has, leads you. It's like you're being led in a certain way, and then things shift at the end. And I noticed that in a number of your stories. How did you develop this style? Because not everyone has that who writes short stories. Why is this part of your maybe unique style? But not every story here has that. But why is it a part?
Well, first of all, it's a metaphor for life. I mean, nobody has to convince any of us after 2020 that the unexpected can happen in our lives and will radically alter our lives, not always for the better. Okay, so we're used to that. I'm deeply influenced by James Joyce, and he wrote a collection of short stories, a wonderful collection called The Dubliners, which is a chronological story. It starts off with a story about a 7-year-old boy and it ends with death. But I'm particularly influenced by the first story, which is about a 7-year-old child who meets a child molester. And it's a horrific story because it's told from the perspective of the 7-year-old child who doesn't realize that he's dealing with a child molester, but the reader does. Mm-hmm. And so what Joyce is doing is playing with perspective. Now, anybody who watches a Hollywood horror movie knows that the protagonist doesn't know that the monster is behind the door, but the audience does know that the monster is behind the door. And that's where the tension comes from. Mm-hmm. So as James Joyce was playing with the reader and exercising a literary prerogative of perspective, so too do many cinematographers do the exact same thing. So I'm employing the same technique in the short story. And I know I'm omniscient in these stories. I know what's going to happen. The poor reader does not. Your reader is actually the poor schlub who's walking through the door and the monster's on the other side of the door. Right. And the difference between the poor slum and the reader is I hope the reader is going to enjoy it being shocked by the monster. And I hope they are shocked by the monster. They get, whoa, that was fun.
Yeah, and not always is it a monster. The Betsy Bob is a great example. But do you have, for instance, in a story like the Betsy Bob, do you have the whole thing planned out in your mind before you, so to speak, put pen to paper, or is it,
No.
or are you a little bit surprised by the ending as well?
No, I'm surprised by the middle. Because in my mind, I actually see the short story as in architectural terms. It just appears to be this way. And what I see is a suspension bridge. You know, for those of you on the East Coast, think the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. Okay, it's not in Cincinnati, but okay. And I know where the bridge begins. I know where the bridge ends. I don't necessarily know how the two of them meet in the middle, the two sides. And it's the same true. I have a novel coming out in April, a very Jewish novel called To All Who Call in Truth, set in a conservative synagogue. A lot of it, you'll enjoy it a lot. It's also a murder mystery. I have a novel I'm working on now, which is another murder mystery set on a Massachusetts island in 1944. I know how the book begins. I know how it ends. I don't have the foggiest notion what happens in the middle. And the idea is not to fall into the Verrazano Narrows. Okay, it's not to fall in, and it's hugely challenging. I don't want to make in any way to see it that it's easy. Structurally, it's extremely difficult. I've always wanted to entertain my reader. I want my reader to be interested all the time. Even the way the stories are ordered in a way to sort of to draw the reader into my world. This very variegated, unexpected world, and to enjoy that journey. But it's all very much thought out. Nothing is left to chance. Nothing is random.
Mm-hmm. I wonder how much in your stories, when you're crafting them, again, you're mentioning that often they just come to you. How much do you specifically want to bring the reader into this multiplicity of perspectives? Because they really, one of the things I loved about the stories, there's so many, the reenactor is a great example of a story that brings us into a perspective that, I never really thought about that. And maybe you can share about that one, but is there a desire to bring us into these different spaces, to have us kind of think about these different worlds when you're creating it, or is it just, it's coming to you? Tell me about that process, and maybe share a little bit about the reenactor and your experience with that.
Well, all these stories are occurring on different levels. It's not one level. So there's the level of the story, which again, it has to be entertaining, it has to be surprising, it has to be different. There's a story, the other level of the story is I'm working out something in myself. And there's even a story that's told from the perspective, talk about God and what happens on the 8th day, and whether God has to decide whether to imbue these human beings, these miserable human beings, with a soul. Okay, and it's a conversation between God and Satan, but it opens up with God, with saying that God looked at this on the 8th day. God looked at the world which he created to affirm something about himself. Okay, which is a Jewish concept. But in the story too, we're trying to work out something in the story that's about us. And in the story, the reenactor grew from experience I had with an IDF delegation visiting Auschwitz. And en route to Auschwitz, we stopped off in this Polish village that used to be a shtetl, used to be populated with Jews. There were no Jews left in this village, but they had all these Jewish restaurants and Jewish music stores and Jewish cultural centers, all run by Poles, some of them who were playing Jews. So it raised the question, what does it mean to be a Polish reenactor of a Jew in a town where all the Jews have been taken out and shot? And the story is told from the perspective of a 26-year-old semi-literate Polish, unemployed Polish factory worker who is actually, he doesn't even quite sure he's ever met a Jew. But he is now dressing up as a Jew and eating and saying Jewish things to tourists who come by and take their pictures with him. Okay, so it's really out of the box. All of these stories finally, and I think that the deepest level of every single one of these stories, Ralph Swallen, is I want to be able to say something about the human condition. I want to say something about reality. So what's going on in this reenactor? It's saying something about the desire to have substance in life. It's talking about what is authenticity. There are deep themes going on in this. as there are deep things that themes in the story of metaxas, which is metaxas comes from a Greek concept. The Greeks were fascinated with human halfness, half goat and half man, half horse and half man, half God and half man. Metaxas is the halfness. And the monster, which this American army captain in 1841 encounters in the Rockies, is half man and half monster. And he himself, the protagonist, is half something. He's half a believer, half a classicist. He's totally torn. So I'm talking in the story. The theme of the story is human halfness. The story of the Betsy Bob. We're talking a lot about the Betsy Bob. I love it. The story there is about the need for spirituality in life and the need for hope. So all the stories are about that theme. Okay, all these different levels.
Well, this is another place that I really love these stories, and why I started off with, so to speak, this being your Torah in many ways, right? Sharing part of your Torah is because in this mitzvah, so Rabbi Akiva says the great mitzvah of the Torah, v'ahavta l'orecha kamocha, love your fellow as yourself, right? But there's a part there of not just love your fellow, but love your fellow as yourself. There's a need there to be able to see from the other's perspective, to see these multiple perspectives. How do I show you love if I have no understanding of who you are, what you're about? And so there are stories that, as you're saying, really delve deep into someone else's personality or what they're going through, or even something that we might take me'alav, like by itself. So for instance, one of the stories I love was Penitence, about a pastor who makes a certain announcement. I'll let everyone read that one. It's a profound announcement that the pastor makes. But to me, one of the things that was so striking was what goes on with the pastor's wife, right? So
from her perspective, right?
That's right. That's right.
So what is that story is about? First of all, again, the different levels. When I grew up in a highly assimilated family, okay? And we didn't keep kosher. We didn't keep much of the holidays. We didn't keep Shabbat, certainly. But I was 15, 16, I went on a spiritual journey. And that journey took me on one level to explore my Jewish roots and studying Gemara with Chabad. And I still putting on the tefillin I got from my Chabad rabbi. And but it took me different directions. I was just interested in spirituality. So one day I knocked on the door of the Baptist church down the street from my house. Pastor Miller came out, a really cool guy. And I said, listen, I want to learn about the New Testament. It's basically a Jewish document. I want to learn about it, but you can't proselytize me. Okay. I just want to learn about it. So for the next year, we did, not exactly Daf Yomi, but we learned the New Testament. And as an ambassador later, I worked for Yitzhak Rabin, Alav Shalom, in the 90s. I was his advisor on church affairs. And then as ambassador, I was dealing with evangelical groups, all different Christian groups, Orthodox Christian groups, Catholic. That knowledge of the New Testament was invaluable to me. But I learned about churches. So why not take a story and put it in a church in a Sunday morning and tell the story from the perspective of the pastor's wife, who's watching her extraordinary pastor husband give a very unusual sermon. Okay. But that's not what the story is about, Rabbi Small. The story is about the eternal nature of revelation. Because one of the great strengths of Judaism, as we know in our communities, is that when God tells Abraham, listen, everybody else is sacrificing their kids. Everyone is worshiping idols. But guess what? You're not going to do that. You're going to be different. Mm-hmm. And even the name of a Hebrew comes from someone who crosses over, goes away. Mm-hmm. Ivri. I speak Hebrew, of the language of people who have crossed over. And Abraham crosses over. And that is the initial impulse of all revealed religions. That it's not about us, it's about God and his prerogatives, not our prerogatives. And what's occurring in our modern times is what I've called the neo-paganism, that we only belong to the church or the synagogue where the God who we worship there believes in our agenda. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if you're in favor of gay marriage, that you're going to go to the God who believes in gay marriage. If you're against gay marriage, you go to the God who's against gay marriage. Okay, so if paganism elevates man to the status of God, neo-paganism elevates ourselves to the status of God. And what's going on in this church is a battle between the two, between the God of Abraham, in this case, the God of a past minister. It doesn't matter whether he's Christian or Jews, it's still the God of Abraham, and modernity and this neo-paganism, where the wife of the pastor is, Abrahamic, but the pastor himself is very modern.
It was again a powerful story, and again for me, I think that the part that was maybe most meaningful was seeing what happens with her, as opposed to there's another woman that appears in the story as well who has a very different reaction, right? Different response to them. But right. I know that so many of these stories are influenced. You mentioned here, this one was influenced by, of course, your relationship in some ways, encountering Christians and kind of going and as an ambassador as well. But there are a lot of these stories that touch on your life. And I see that, when reading through your book, Ally, which I highly recommend to everyone. And I want to come back to you just for a brief moment. But there are a lot of these stories that tie into parts of your life. One of them, of course, is Dead of Old Wounds. And that one is another one that I thought was an incredible story, really artistically done, both from the beginning about what's going on and then the big message about what happens in the story. But I wondered if you might share a little bit about that one as well, and how that relates to your life, how that comes in.
Well, it begins with the story of my father, who landed on Normandy Beach and fought through World War II as a World War II hero. And the story opens with a conversation between a doctor and his son, looking at an X-ray of the son's father, who has died of sepsis in the late 90s. But it turns out the sepsis, when they look at the X-ray, there's a bullet lodged in his pelvis that the father never told the son about, which he received in the first wave of Normandy Beach, of Normandy landing. But that's, of course, not what the story's about. The story's about old wounds, and the old wound is a crisis that occurred in the young man's marriage, and the question whether they can actually survive the old wound, or will the marriage die of the old wound. And so it's about fathers and sons. It's about the past and its relationship to the present, but it's also ultimately about love and relationships between married couples. And who in our lives don't have wounds in our marriage lives, in our personal lives, and wounds that we can either get over, they'll heal, or the relationship will die from them.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the connection between that story and Fossils as well, where you have similar but different. Let
me tell you about Fossils. I'll surprise you with Fossils. Fossils, no spoilers here, no spoilers. Fossils is a conversation between two women, one of whom is in their late 70s, early 80s. The other one is quite aged. And they're walking along a beach, and they're holding hands because these two women have been lovers for many, many years. And over the course of this conversation, they also talk about a trauma early in their relationship and the way they have or have not gotten over the trauma. It's also an old wound. You're absolutely right for seeing that connection. I never saw that connection, by the way. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think whether those stories are sufficiently placed.
No, there's space. One is kind of, yeah.
It's great. It's good nexus. But where does that story come from? How do I get into the minds of two, octogenarian gay women? And it comes from the fact that when I was in elementary school, the teachers I had been hired during the Great Depression. And during the Great Depression, if you were a married woman, you couldn't get a job as a teacher because the assumption was that you had a source of income from your husband. So all the women they hired in the 30s were single women. And it turned out that almost all of my teachers, this is now in the 1960s, were gay. And some of them had relations with one another, including my principal and one of my teachers who were my favorite teacher, my favorite principal. It turned out that they would spend every summer on a beach house somewhere. And so the principal and the teacher become the model for these two women walking down the beach and talking about a painful episode that occurred 40 years before their relationship. Fossils.
Yeah. That's another, it's a great story.
Oh, I love that story.
Both of those, both of those.
Yeah.
Okay, here's one, a kind of meta question on the whole book, which is the story, The Night Archer. So it's at the very end of the book, and that becomes the main, that's the title for the entire work, The Night Archer.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, what about that short story, and it's one of the shorter ones there, what about that kind of drew you in to call the whole collection by that name?
Because I mostly because of the title. I wanted something that was dreamy, otherworldly. And yeah, the actual story of The Night Archer is only a page long. It's sort of an ode to an imaginary figure who appears in my night and helps me go to sleep. Appears in my head at night and helps me go to sleep because I was a lifelong insomniac. And so it's my paean to him. But if you look at the cover, those of you who can see the cover, it's dreamy. Yeah. And it's going to take you someplace you haven't been before. It's not, unlike many of the stories, it's not a particularly Jewish story at all, but it does draw on my historical knowledge, and you'll get it. It's about an archer at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. And what can I say? I taught military history, so I know a lot of this stuff. Most of the stories, though, many of the stories are very Jewish. And if I could just take a minute and just talk about the Jewish talk, would you mind?
Yes.
For me, writing is freedom. Okay, it's about being anybody, anywhere, anytime I want to be. There's no freedom like it. Mm-hmm. But it's not the freedom that we wanted in the 60s and the 70s, where sort of everyone goes. It's a very Jewish style of freedom. Because our freedom is the freedom where you get out of Egypt, you're going to go directly to Sinai. And mm-hmm. you're gonna get the law. And what the message of Sinai is that there's no true freedom without limitations, without law. And this is one of the great gifts of the Jewish people to civilization. It gets hardwired into the minds of the founding fathers of the United States. They put it into the Constitution. It's precisely what the Constitution is about. The only way we're going to guarantee this freedom is by limiting it, put checks and balances in. That's precisely what writing is. And particularly short story writing, because in a short story, a writer has to do in 3 pages what a novelist does in 300 pages. You got to get the character, you got to get the dialogue, you got to get the story, you got to get the dramatic tension. The discipline is extraordinary for me, very difficult. And the short story, in particular, is a Jewish form, because I'm sitting here in Jaffa, and in Jaffa we have archaeological digs, we dig up all sorts of things. We don't dig up anything that can be identified as authentic Jewish art. It's always derivative. It's Roman art, it's Greek art, it's Islamic art, I think Jewish art. We read in the Psalms about instruments, about timbrels and cymbals and trumpets. We really don't know what ancient Jewish music sounded like, but we do have, in massive abundance, is literature. And most of that literature is short stories. And, Jaffa, the scene of the book of Jonah, which is all of a page and a half long. And there's just so much in the book of Jonah. You could sit and study the book of Jonah forever. For me, it's a primary and it's a primer on international relations and politics. But that's what we have. So the short story form, writing is very Jewish. Short story forming is Jewish. The freedom that comes with the writing short story is a very Jewish type of freedom that has all sorts of limitations.
Have you been drawn in that vein? A lot of the Jewish stories are based on characters in Tanakh and kind of filling out details.
Hold on, we're having some technical difficulties.
This, a very Jewish book.
Sorry, Michael, we're gonna need
okay, good. You froze right.
We're gonna need you to repeat that.
What happened? The whole thing? I lost the whole thing?
Yeah, you lost the whole thing.
No, you're kidding me.
No. We got the derivative trumpets. It was just the last 30 seconds.
Oh, that's it. So I said that, maybe the last 40 seconds, but okay. Is that we don't know what Jewish music sounded like. We don't know what ancient music sounded like. What we know is literature, that we have a vast abundance of literature. And most of the literature of the Bible is short stories. And I was saying that I live in Jaffa. It's the scene of the book of Jonah, which is all of a page and a half long. But you can get so much out of the book of Jonah. You can discuss it for weeks. I see it as a political primer. And The Bible has that type of freedom of writing, it has the great economy of language, but it has the restrictions on that writing. And that, to me, was what makes short stories very Jewish, and that's what makes this book a very Jewish book.
Mm-hmm. I was interested in, of course, Day 8 and also Jacariah. You kind of
Jacariah, the book of Jacariah.
Jacariah. So so in both of those, you, if you will, riff off of Tanakh.
Yeah, I do.
And I wondered if you might be interested to do more of that in the future. That in terms of Jewish midrash, Jewish literature, that's certainly been over the ages, a key way that Jews have written. Namely, here's basic ideas from the Tanakh, but what was Avram like when he was a little kid, right? And so we have that famous midrash there. And that's a little bit of those two stories of kind of playing off or riffing off of Tanakh. Do you have a desire to do a little more of that in the future as well?
Well, I'm halfway through my next collection of short stories. And one of the short stories takes place on the last day of the Garden of Eden. One of the short stories is an encounter in a men's room in a Talmud Torah between a frustrated rabbi and a Talmudic demon. No kidding. Lots of demons in the Talmud. He actually meets one in the bathroom, and it's about their relationship. So yeah, obviously I'm deeply influenced by these themes, but I'm interested in the spiritual themes generally. The story of the book of Jacariah is a conversation between God and a failed prophet who didn't quite make the grade. And what's Habakkuk got that I ain't got? And other than the funny name. And Jacariah is kind of pissed off at God. He's an angry prophet. And so it's about prophecy, but it's also asking a very fundamental question. We attribute or we assign many attributes to God. God is merciful, God is compassionate, God can be jealous, God can be wrathful, but there's one major human attribute that God never gets, and that is God funny? Does God have a sense of humor? That's what this story is about. Is God funny?
It's great. It's a great story. I loved it.
But for the record, the God of Corona is not funny.
Yeah, exactly. Michael, let me ask, one of the other books that I really loved, of course, was Ally. And as an American rabbi, do you have it there?
I got it here, Ally.
We also put it, again, the link is in the chat. I highly recommend it. As an American rabbi, one of the things that I'm very interested in doing is increasing connections between my congregation here in Cincinnati, Ohio, and Israel. And I wanted to see, you have in Ally, your tremendous love for both the United States and for Israel really shows. And so I wanted to ask, do you have recommendations for me as a rabbi for how we can better connect our community to Israel?
I think that in literature or just physically?
In all kinds of, really in terms of the heart, I think is most important. How can we make that connection so that, as you mentioned in Ally, so that it gets into someone's kishkas?
Well, just for a book, my best friend is a gentleman named Yossi Klein Levy. Some of you may have seen him. He had a New York Times bestseller list 2 years ago with a book called Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor.
Yes.
Where he addresses essays on what is Judaism, why are we in this country, what's our connection here. He's writing it to his Palestinian neighbor, but it's a book that speaks to young liberal American Jews who don't understand what this whole Israel Jewish peoplehood thing about. And it answers that question. So I would strongly recommend that book. Ally is a very pained book. It's as my friend Danny Gord has pointed out, that the Ally is actually an erotic title. It should have a question mark at it. Ally, how do you observe this alliance? It's a very hard book. It's where all this white hair came from. During that period, it was a very, very tough period. And we've gone through one tough period after another. How do we maintain this alliance, which is crucial, not just for the United States and Israel, but for the two largest communities in the Jewish world? How do we continue to talk to one another? Very difficult in an age in which discourse itself has become almost impossible. But beyond that, there are two venues which I think are very crucial for connecting Jews worldwide. One of them is simply the Hebrew language. To participate in any way in the realities of Israel. People in America think they know a lot about Israel. I mean, if you ask somebody outside of the United States, whether they thought the United States should pursue this policy, that policy, and they were very adamant about it, but they didn't speak a word of English. All right, you look at them rather askance, or they didn't know what the Constitution was, they didn't know the Declaration of Independence was. That's the majority of people we're dealing with in the United States who know exactly how we should conduct our foreign policy. Whether it's with the Palestinians or the Iranians, don't know anything. They don't know Arabic, or they don't know Persian, don't know Farsi, they don't know Hebrew. Hebrew is the entree. Hebrew is the window, and it is not an easy language, but it's far. I believe I've been studying French for years, and it's far easier than French. It's only 3,000 words is a good vocabulary in Hebrew. And the other is emphasizing Jewish peoplehood. Because at the end of the day, we're going to disagree about policy. We're going to disagree about who we want for president. We're going to disagree about many, many things. But what we all have in common at the end of the day is that we are family. We're mishpocha.
Yeah.
We're a big, noisy, impossible, rancorous, cantankerous mishpocha. And anything that endows and instills that sense of peoplehood in your congregation, by coming to Israel, by being involved in that type of people, by sponsoring Jewish, Israeli emissaries, shlichim, who come in your community. And I know there are a number of them at the University of Cincinnati because I've been there. That is so crucial. That is so crucial.
Well, thank you so much. And I appreciate you mentioning peoplehood and the fact that we're all one mishpacha. And I understand you must have heard my sermon yesterday, so thank you. And Adam, did you want to kind of come in here?
I figured that this was a great time to kind of move into the Q&A portion of our program. And I just took a few notes based on the conversation that you guys had in front of us all, which was, honestly, it was very rewarding to listen to you guys speak. But Michael, there was a lot of stuff at the end of your talk that you really kind of hit on some great points that the rabbi was able to bring out, in my opinion. And a lot of it is you talking about the freedom that you have. Yeah, the wine too, I'm sure helps. L'chaim. We didn't play a drinking game on this episode of
so good. That's quite good. Lovely
right?
Wine.
Like,
lovely wine. Yeah.
Listen, I'm just happy to see you drinking red and not white. That's all.
It's a lot for me. Go ahead.
I know it's a big deal, but there's something. How do I explain this? I was very influenced by your writing, the Shalem Center, the new thinkers of let's say the late 90s and the early 2000s in terms of Zionist thought, which led me to, moving to Israel and, my identity changing because of the words on the page. The country, Israel, was built by writers. The founder of the Zionist movement was a writer. Like you said, we have Jewish texts. We don't have the remnant of our history in terms of what Herzl said of the Jewish state had been reduced to nothing but the faith of our fathers. We have our we were talking about the Talmud earlier. It was originally oral. It was put to text. And the reason why I brought up sovereignty was because the idea of sovereignty and text and the Talmud, it changes everything. So, how much, I guess I would have to word this question is, how much of your freedom as a writer have you gotten from your Zionism, or how much of your freedom as a writer has influenced your Zionism? Because I also know, just from conversations with you, that you've had your ups and your downs with your Zionism, just like you've had with your career as a writer.
Oh boy, mostly downs. Mostly downs. One of the great downs, if we're talking about downs, was my failure to write fiction in Hebrew. You know that I write fairly regularly for the Israeli press. I interview on Israeli television. I speak in front of the Knesset while people are screaming at me. So my Hebrew is at a very high level, sometimes a little bit too high. My assistants want me to down it down. But when it comes to writing fiction, the language of my soul is English. And I've tried, and I haven't succeeded to write that way in Hebrew. I write nonfiction in Hebrew, just not fiction. So And yet, when you move to Israel, you are achieving freedom. We have freedom in this country, but that freedom again comes with all sorts of limitations. We pay taxes. We try, some of us, to observe the traffic regulations. We serve in the military, which is the total absence of freedom once you put on that uniform. But we serve in the military in order to maintain our freedom, in order to preserve our freedom. So we have what I call the Jewish paradox of freedom here. And here we have it in its most, in its most concrete manifestation. We have freedom, and we say it in the Hatikva, V'yotam chofshi b'artzeinu, to be a free people in our land. But, and it's a big but, that freedom is not the freedom of, Haight-Ashbury or Greenwich Village, 1968. It's the freedom of Beersheba. It's the freedom of Ramat Yishai, 1948. Right? Different.
Very, very different. Very different. I thought it was interesting that you were talking about the new neo-paganism, and that both of you kind of started to get into it, and it seemed as if you understood each other and what you were referring to. And our last program that we did was with Natan Sharansky and Gil Troy, and they talked about the neo-Soviet messaging that's going on today. And I wanted to know your opinion, just based on in terms of the attack on identity today, if you see a connection to what you were talking about in terms of, how people will only go to the house of worship that worships their God. Do you think that they have something to do with each other, or is one because of the other? What would you go? I mean, I'd like to hear from both of you on that.
Well, it's just, we've elevated identity to a type of religion. And anybody who knows what's going on in the United States, many people have said it, it's not original with me, that what's going on in identity politics with cancel culture is a type of religion and a type of inquisition along with that religion. So yes, we've elevated that identity we've deified it in so many ways, which is disturbing. If I just to get off the heavy subject, I'll tell you a semi-funny, semi-tragic story about neo-paganism. And that is, I almost lost my job in the Knesset because of it. Why? A couple of years ago, I was invited to give a series of high holiday sermons at conservative reform synagogues in the United States as Netanyahu's deputy. And I did. And when you're writing a sermon, this, Rabbi Smolin, you got to give a sermon that American Jews are going to listen to, not that Israeli Jews are going to listen to. They're very different. So I talked about being a kid who had dyslexia, who had, was not very good at sports. I talked about a kid who had a personal relationship with God from my earliest time. I've always been a believer. I've always been very faithful. And in America, if you are even a president like Trump is going to talk about his faith. Every president has to talk about faith. Everyone has to, and every American politician at some level has to talk about his relationship with God. So I'm giving the sermon out in Los Angeles, and someone slips me a note and says that Shimon Peres has died. And I have to get back to the funeral. I worked very closely with Peres, but also world leaders were coming, and I had to assist the prime minister in hosting these world leaders. And so I felt very bad because I had to cancel out on all these synagogues. Well, the rabbis were counting on me, right? They're going to have to write the sermon because I'm not going to be there. So on the way to the airport, I stopped off at the Israeli consulate and I recorded my sermon, right? And one of the big themes in the sermon was neo-paganism and how we have to overcome it. And I left it and I sent it to all the rabbis. I get back to Israel, go through the funeral of Shimon Peres, and then find that I'm the front page item and the front item on the New York News. Everybody is making fun of me. Why? Because it turns out that while in America, Barack Obama has to talk about the difficulty he had growing up with a name like Barack Obama and having big ears. He used to talk about it all the time. In Israel, you never, ever talk as a politician about difficulties you had in life. Never. Right? And the one thing you never talk about, even if you're a Haredi, even if you're ultra-Orthodox, you never talk about your relationship with God.
Yeah.
You can talk about keeping mitzvahs, but you never talk about faith, ever, ever. So people were saying, because I talked about the fact that I believed in God, people were saying that I had gone insane. That's amazing.
I remember this.
Yeah. It was crazy. Some religious people some more religious people come up to me, especially young religious people come to me in the street and say, thank me for that sermon. Because no Israeli politician has ever given a sermon like that, ever. But, apropos of Negro-paganism, almost cost me my job.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, no,
the next memoir.
I remember when that happened because Haaretz was claiming that you had lost your mind. It was like, it was so ridiculous.
Madness.
No,
crazy.
It was also when your party was doing very well in the beginning as well, and it was just easy to attack. And it was also right after Ally had come out, if I'm correct.
And they attacked me on that too. It's okay.
And I definitely recommend to everybody that is watching tonight that if you have not read Michael's book Ally, which is also an amazing book, in my opinion, it encapsulates better than anything, which I think comes out in this book a lot, your story and experience as an immigrant and what it's like not to have the dual loyalties, but you very well in that book articulate what it is to be a modern American Jew that makes Aliyah, and what many people in your who also have walked in your shoes feel and think. And I think that's, I mean, like, how does your experience as an immigrant influence you in these specific short stories?
My immigrant, there's no story about Aliyah here, but obviously the fact that I'm writing about Israel in English. There's one story which was very deep for me. I don't know if this appealed to you, Rabbi Smolensky. It's called the Hero's Widow. And it's clearly an Israeli story.
Yep.
And it grew out of a time when I was in diplomacy, and I had a close friend who was an ambassador, a woman, whose first husband had been killed in the Yom Kippur War. And she had a second husband who was an immigrant to Israel from South America. And I used to ask myself, what did it feel like to be the husband of the hero's widow? And who was also an immigrant. And that's what this story is about. Now, of course, again, there's another layer to it. The layer is what is the nature of heroism? What is the nature of courage? But it's very much dealing with the immigrant experience. And what does it mean to marry to someone who's to be an immigrant and marry an Israeli icon?
Yeah, that was an excellent story. It was another terrific one. One thing I'm going to put in the chat. If you're interested like me in getting more insight into these stories, and Michael, I would just love to talk. There's so many of them that, here we're trying not to give the end away and stuff like that, but there's so many of them that I'd love to chat with you about. But if you want more insight, there's Apple Podcast has The Mind Behind the Story, The Night Archer by Michael Oren. So I'm going to put that link to those podcasts, and they're free and incredible. I would recommend reading the stories and then looking at the podcasts, but they're great.
And then here again, I want to thank Adam Bellows for everything he did with that, because he recorded those podcasts. Yeah. And
for 15 hours or 18 hours it took.
It's crazy. We sent it out. We sent it out to a sound engineer in Oregon, who then informed us that he was living in a hotel because his house had burnt down during the terrible fires. It was just, what it took to get those 18, stories out on Apple was itself an odyssey.
I introduced you to Tedder Pizza that night. It's the best.
That was great.
Yeah, Al Shadi's Pizza.
Great pizza. Any questions from the audience?
Yes. That's what I was just about to get to. So Brad Braitman has actually a really cool question. It's not particular to one of your short stories, but it's directed at a comment that you made. And I actually think this is kind of cool. It says, as a diplomat, do you often have a sense that a negotiation might end, but are unsure about the middle? How does that affect your approach? And that's actually a really cool question based on what you were saying about how you see your short stories.
But that's core. So you go into negotiation, you actually know what your goal is. The question is how you're going to get there. So you know what the beginning place is. You want to get to an end place. It's how do you get there? And of course, it typifies diplomacy, all diplomacy. I'm writing now an article. I hope it will come out in the Atlantic next week. I write for the Atlantic, which will be the ultimate argument against the Iran nuclear deal. And one of the arguments made that I wrote in the article was that the American negotiators who first met with the Iranians knew what they wanted. They knew the deal that they wanted, and because they knew what the deal they wanted, they made extraordinary concessions up front. In the process, lied to us about them. They so much wanted the deal that they're willing to betray their Middle Eastern allies because they wanted the deal, and so they were going to make those concessions up front.
Okay, yeah, that's a good question.
I would hold on to that. That's a story.
And listen, I could go into Iran, and I'm sure everybody would have tons of questions, but we're not going to do that tonight. So,
please.
We're going to spare you from that.
Good question, though.
Gary Smith, it was a great question. Gary Smith would like to know, how did you come up with the story of the Night Archer, and what in the title suggests something that your life is about, and what can we take away from this?
I think the note, well, as they say in Talmudic story, there's the pshat of the story, and the pshat of the story is about being an insomniac and how an imaginary character who appears to me at night helps me fall asleep. That's the pshat of the story. What it's also about is about the flight of imagination and taking wing and shooting an arrow in the air where the arrow basically disappears. You're not quite sure what's going to come down. That in so many ways is the creative process. And giving yourself flight, to extend the metaphor, in writing, you are both the archer and the arrow.
Wow. All right. Well, I have another question, and I would kind of like to, I think we'll wrap up after this one. Unless there are any more questions that I didn't get to, I was only asking the questions that I thought were appropriate based on the topic for tonight. But I would like to ask a question that's somewhat off topic, only because of the goal of what we're doing here tonight and why we're starting to do these webinars with so many different people. And Michael, I really hope that I can convince you to do an American Torah, US history, like founding fathers type of talk at some point, because it would probably be absolutely awesome to do. And the topic would just, I mean, like, I'm sure everybody would find it interesting because you've written so much about it, but I mean, oh, what are you looking for? Power, faith, and yeah.
It's all in here.
It's all in there.
Oh, 700 pages here.
I mean,
the story about Torah in the United States of America.
So many people would just find that so fascinating. And the reason why I bring it up is because, again, you're one of the most well-known American immigrants to Israel in the last 50 years. And this book, you constantly talk about writing in English, about writing about Israel in English. And like in Ally, how I said that it's a great articulation of what that identity is of somebody that makes Aliyah just through your eyes and through your story. Our goal is to connect as many people to Israel as possible through culture, through wine, through art, through all of the things that have been reborn in the last 70, 100 years because of the Zionist movement. What is if you could achieve one thing when it comes to bridging the divide between America and Israel and or Jews of Israelis and American Jews, or just Israel and the diaspora, what would that be? What would you like people to take away that could bring people closer to Israel? What would you say are the main things that are maybe missing for people to connect in a much stronger and deeper and more authentic way? In terms of how you've become so strongly connected to Israel and so many other people like you have. Does that make sense? Sorry.
I can boil it down to one word. It's called listening. And the greatest challenge we have faced in recent years is that we've ceased listening to one another. And I found in Israel generally, and particularly in leadership circles, people are deeply, deeply ignorant about the American Jewish experience. I think those of you may have read a piece I put in the Jerusalem Post last month about my father's death, and it told the story of my father's interaction with A.B. Yoshua. You can look up, those who haven't seen it, look online, me, Jerusalem Post, A.B. Yoshua. And A.B. Yoshua was a person who came out and said that American Jews, and I love A.B. Yoshua, I love his writing and I love him personally, but came out and said repeatedly that American Jews are only partially Jews. And Israeli Jews are complete Jews. And this is from a man who's a very secular Jew, okay? But what A.B. understood is, if you just not understand that American Jews are complete Jews, but in their way, not in an Israeli way. And on the Israeli side, we see again and again, on the American side, we see that people have very little knowledge of what the realities are here, what Israelis feel. And we have just ceased to listen to one another. And if I think we listen, we can begin to understand that, yes, we're going to have differences. Yes, we inherent differences. But what we have to do at the end of the day is understand that that we are part of this one people, Rabbi Small, and that we are this family, and that oneness, that peopleness transcends all of these differences.
Beautiful.
Well put. Rabbi, would you like to add anything?
No, just I love that last part. It's so important in Judaism. We talk about Shivim Panim LaTorah, that there are 70 facets to the Torah. It's such an important part of Judaism to understand multiple perspectives. And I think, in terms of kind of when you're talking about this neo-paganism, part of it is just, nope, my perspective is the only one and it's correct. And it's hard for people right now to really open up and Shema Yisrael, listen and hear the other's perspective. Right. And I think that is such sage advice. And it's one of the things that I appreciated most about your book, Ally, is being able to kind of, if you will, kind of see this other perspective of our ally a little bit more, coming from the perspective of living in the United States. It's important to kind of hear that other perspective of, well, what is it like for Israelis in terms of these issues? So, I love what you're saying. The more that we can listen to one another, the more that we can see different perspectives, the more that we can have a meta understanding that we're part of one family. That's so important to the Jewish people and to the whole world, really.
Amen.
Beautiful Torah. Uvatorah to yageh yomam v'layla.
Yeshkach. Thank you all. Adam, thank you.
Thank you, Adam. This is wonderful to just have this opportunity, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and especially having these different speakers really helps us to listen to different perspectives, and especially for folks in the United States to really hear from some of this great, exciting minds in Israel is really fabulous. So tremendous. Toda rabah and yasher koach.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for doing such a great job. It was such a pleasure. I hope everybody enjoyed it.